So let's say that we're all herdsmen, right? That's our thing. We raise cattle. Now, we're all competing with each other. So the more animals you have in your herd, the better off you are relative to me. So it's kind of a race who can have the most cattle, right? So there's a couple caveats here. One is that we're all using the same plot of land, so all of our herds are currently grazing on the same pasture. We all have unrestricted access to the same public or common pasture. And the other caveat is that the pasture is currently at carrying capacity, which means it's at a sustainable limit of cows. So think of this as your bank account, right? You can't spend more money than you have coming in. And you can, but it's not sustainable. So if you're spending as much as it's coming in, you can just keep doing that. However, if you're spending more than what's coming in, it's just eventually it's going to dive bomb and hit the wall at some point. The populations really respond the same way. So if you're at carrying capacity, you're at your sustainable limit right there. You're at this kind of nice balance. So let's say this pasture is at that nice balance, and we're all currently exploiting with all of our relative herd. So what do you do as a competitor in this situation? What do? Do you add another animal to your herd? Why not? If you add another animal to your herd, well, you get that cow. We all share in the cost of the pasture being overloaded, but you benefited from that. So ultimately, we're all sharing in the cost, but you're benefiting. So you can see how that would obviously, if you're guided by self-interest, would drive you to just add more animals to your herd because it makes sense. There's a finite resource out there. If I exploit more of it, I will have more of it and have an advantage over individuals that exploit less of it. So you can easily see how natural selection should favor more and more and more and more, or greater and greater degrees of exploitation over prudence. However, let's say everybody does that. Everyone goes, oh, okay, I'm going to add an animal to my herd so I can beat you, and then so on and so forth, and then the pasture is overloaded and the resource goes to extinction, and then we're all suffering at this point. And therein lies the tragedy. So how do we avoid this tragedy? What happened there? You can see the trade-off is as exploitation is favored at the individual level, it can actually lead to these detrimental consequences to the population. So selection at the individual level is insensitive to the welfare of the group or the population. So here, exploitation is clearly favored. However, at the population level, the more exploitation that's expressed by the population, the more doomed the population is. And then again, therein lies the tragedy of the tragedy of the commons. So this is all part of this greater notion called evolutionary suicide. And this was first observed by J.B.S. Haldane, who is a preeminent biologist, mathematician. In the 1930s, he actually initially observed that what's good for the individual is not necessarily what's good for the population. And it might seem counterintuitive, but obviously he was looking at some of these exploitative strategies I just mentioned. He just goes, hey, these are good for the individual, but as you can see, if the whole population sort of continues down that path, it could be catastrophic. So ultimately, he said, if you keep extrapolating on this notion, then you could lead to very, very, very detrimental population consequences to the population, particularly extinction. And that was later formalized mathematically and theoretically by a number of biologists and mathematicians under the notion of evolutionary suicide. And that stuff gets it's heavy. it's heavy in the math, but the basic notion is very conceptual and very understandable. And that is quite simply that selection at that individual level, what's good for that individual at that moment, that short-term exploit for that individual, is insensitive to what's good for the welfare of the group or the population as a whole. And therein lies this conflict, and that'll drive sort of this tragedy to occur. So that general notion of evolutionary suicide was first observed again by J.B.S. Haldane, but popularized later by Garrett Hardin, and then formalized later mathematically by a series of biologists and mathematicians. The tragedy of the commons has been applied to many, many other contexts. Obviously, not just cattle. So think of scenarios such as food. Food consumption. Obviously, we're talking about the cattle. Now think about overall populations, or even just water, or even overfishing is a really good one. Just think of this body of water that's currently overfished, and you have these competing industries or these competing companies that are trying to obviously increase efficiency, and they're all competing against each other. But the current population that they're fishing at is overfished, so it's unsustainable. So it's going to be declining in numbers over time. So the only solution really for the collective interest is everyone just kind of backs off. But ultimately, if you're competing, then you're not necessarily looking for that long-term success. You're more or less looking for that short-term gain, that immediate advantage. So that short-term, immediate individual self-interest is going to drive exploitation. It's going to cause individuals to fish more than their rivals, and then they're going to win. And if that strategy is replicated, then everyone essentially fails. But ultimately, you can, when you see these examples, you try to say, you sit back and you say, well, why wouldn't everything just be better if everyone just sat back and expressed prudence? But now let's be rational about this, or let's be systematic about this. Okay, now let's pit the exploitative strategy against the prudent strategy now. Okay, so we're in this tragedy of the commons scenario, or we're all still herdsmen again, right? And then now we're all of us collectively up against this carrying capacity, where now the pasture is currently at its carrying capacity. Now, let's say that I express prudence and I say, you know what, bad for the rest of us if I go ahead and add more animals to my herd. I should just back off. If not reduce my herd, actually, to benefit everyone else, at essentially a cost to myself. Now, pit that against a strategy that goes, yeah, I don't care because I get that cow. If I had another cow, yeah, sure, it's going to bother everybody. It's going to hurt everybody. We're all going to suffer from this. But I'm going to benefit, so I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. Now, if you just compare those right next to each other, side by side, you can see that the individual that just simply takes more, that just exploits more and more and more, is going to have an immediate local advantage over this more of long-term sort of prudent strategy. And again, that's why the tragedy sort of ensues. So this was actually a notion that I explored while I was in graduate school, applying this sort of tragedy of the commons framework or perspective in a novel context. So yeah, it's been applied to food and water and pollution and climate change. But I wanted to apply it to sort of novel context, and that was to female fitness. So now bear with me. This is all revolves around this field of sexual conflict. And the notion of sexual conflict is that females and males, or basically the sexes, on average, have diverging evolutionary interests. And you can just think about this purely in the context of reproductive potential. There's a lot of things that go into this, but to really just simplify it down and really break it down, just think about reproductive potential. So a male, let's say, if he mates with, say, 100 females, he could have possibly, give or take, 100 offspring. A female, if she does the same, will have the same amount of offspring than if she mated with, say, 1 or 2 individuals. So ultimately, male's fitness is, again, in the simplified context, male fitness is increased by increasing access to mates or mating opportunities. So a male that acquires more matings will have a higher reproductive success, essentially, than a male that requires fewer matings. So natural selection should favor traits amongst males that increase their ability to acquire more mates or more matings, because of its direct tie to fitness. So this can lead to traits, showiness, and make it more attractive. That should increase, the attraction of females to this individual. But it can also lead to other traits, more exploitative traits, more harmful traits, for like mating aggression, because males are more harassing or just more out there and more aggressive. They, at the end of the day, will acquire more opportunities, mating opportunities. So selection ultimately should be favoring traits in males that's going to increase their ability to gain access to mates and mating opportunities. But that is not necessarily the case for females. For females, again, the more mating she acquires does not necessarily equal higher fitness or higher reproductive productivity. She should actually have the highest quality of mate, because of this limited sort of potential. So extra matings shouldn't really be that beneficial for her. Obviously, you want to assess what's out there, but at the end of the day, superfluous mating should be harmful to females, whereas extra matings and stuff like that are helpful to males. The opposite essentially is true for females. So while you have selection favoring these traits in males that are trying to increase mating opportunities and increase access to mates, you're going to actually have the opposite in females. You're going to have females sort of have more resistance, because those increased mating opportunities do not necessarily help. So now you have a conflict here, and that conflict is generally what we refer to as sexual conflict, and that has a lot of implications, as you could imagine. So this tragedy that commons in sexual conflict scenario, it's really exemplified in the example of the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster. So fruit flies, they engage in multiple mating. So males will mate with multiple females, females will mate with multiple males. So it's kind of a free-for-all a little bit. So you can imagine that males will achieve higher fitness the more females that they acquire. But at the same time, they're going to achieve higher fitness by increasing their chance of paternity within each of the females that they essentially mated with. So obviously, every female is going to mate with multiple males. So how does any given male try to have the paternity advantage over the other males in that scenario? So selection should obviously increase those traits. And you actually get this, and you see profound examples of this in the fruit flies. You have males that will produce in their semen these accessory proteins. They're also called sex peptides. And these accessory proteins, these additional proteins in their semen, will have spermicidal properties, so it'll actually kill rival male sperm. It can actually modify female's behavior to make her less likely to mate again. It can make her just egg dump, where she's basically just producing all of her eggs essentially at once. And even in some cases, it can form the semen can form a plug that sort of prevent other males from being able to mate with her soon after. So these things, all of it, obviously dramatically increase a male's chance of paternity over his rivals. But the other consequence of this is to female fitness. So yeah, as a male, if you put males, and one male produces a ton of this stuff, and another produces none of it, and you put him in a direct competition over a female, and you say, okay, who wins? Clearly, the ones that produce more and more and more of this stuff are going to be favored by selection. But if you keep extrapolating from there, you go, oh, okay, well, males should be producing tremendous amounts of this stuff. You say, okay, well, what about the other side? What effect does this have on females? And then what you notice is that the greater the concentration of this stuff that females are exposed to, actually the shorter they live, the less eggs they produce over their lifetime. So ultimately we have, again, the same scenario where competition over a resource, so competition over females, is actually going to lead to the exhaustion of these individuals, and the exhaustion of the resource that you're actually competing over. So this was actually demonstrated beautifully by Stuart Wigby and Tracy Chapman. So they investigated this in Drosophila melanogaster, and they had two different populations. So in these two populations, one, they had males that produced these accessory proteins, these sex peptides, as usual, and another population where these males were deficient. They lacked the ability to produce these competitive proteins. So obviously, if you put these males in head-to-head competition, the males that produce larger amounts or greater amounts of this peptides will have an advantage over the males that don't within any given female. But the population level, they found tremendous differences. So females that were in the population where males were not producing these competitive, these sort of conflicting proteins, those females lived significantly longer and produced more eggs. So therefore, that population had a dramatically greater reproductive potential than the population that was sort of overrun with conflict. So another example of the sexual conflict as a tragedy of the commons is in the waterfowl, so in mallard ducks specifically. So these are these kind of fancy ducks. You see them everywhere. Very, very brightly colored, a lot of iridescent colors. So these males are insanely competitive over females, to the point actually where their fight over a female, like literally on top of a female, can result in her drowning. And so I mean, it's literal to the point of competition over the resource can lead to the exhaustion and extinction of the resource. So literally, competition literally over top of the female can lead to her extinction. So ultimately, seeing this example, I contacted the main researcher, Patty Brennan, and I said, "Hey, there's got to be some counterbalance, because when I look at these examples of fruit flies where males produce these extremely harmful proteins, and I see your examples of sexual conflict in waterfowl where males are so aggressive that females are dying directly as a result of the competition. Why are there still fruit flies and ducks outside? Why do they exist? I don't understand." So that was really the question that I sought to answer, is how in these contexts where the most harmful strategy for the population seems to be the most fit strategy, why are these populations still existing? Why are they still out there in nature? And I thought that this is where I had sort of the ideal, I was in the ideal situation to sort of tackle this adventure, because I was coming from a background of studying cooperation, and in that context, or altruism, and in that context, you can see that being a cooperator is immediately locally disadvantageous to being a cheater. You think, oh, I'll help you, I'm going to take advantage of you, and who wins, So I was used to looking at these strategies where one doesn't seem to have any sort of advantage overall against its rival, yet you see them exist to just find the overall population. So I want to apply that sort of same framework, that multi-level selection framework, to the field of sexual conflict, and say, can we equate these prudent males, the ones that aren't running after females, can we associate them, or can we equate them to these prudent consumers of resources in the tragedy of the commons scenario? These sort of long-term sustainable, strategies. And can we equate these aggressive individuals to these more exploitative strategies? And in both contexts, you're getting different strategies of exploitation of a shared common resource. The prudent long-term ones in the tragedy of the commons scenario being ones that won't add more animals to their herd or reduce the size of the herd. And in the case of mating conflict or sexual conflict, you see these are males that aren't aggressively pursuing females or producing fewer sex peptides. So do we get the same dynamic in the field of sexual conflict that we do in the tragedy of the commons, where yes, we see this huge difference locally where this exploitative strategy can win, but at the same time, if we take a step back, are groups that are more populated with these exploitative individuals, more vulnerable to extinction than groups that contain fewer individuals. So ultimately, can we apply the same multi-level selection framework that we would towards resolving scenarios such as cooperation? Can we apply the same framework to the field of sexual conflict? So I'll give way and let my PhD advisor from the time, David Sloan Wilson, describe our research on that topic.
A species of insect called the water strider, which is a wonderful insect that skates on the surface of pools and in streams. And it turns out that in water striders, there's enormous individual differences among males in their aggressiveness towards females. And some males are sexual predators. They're just hunting for females. And when they find one, they attack them, and frankly, they rape them, or at least they attempt to. At the opposite end of the continuum, there's males that are gentlemen. They're docile towards female, and they wait to be asked to perform their manly duty, okay? So why do we get these individual differences in males? My graduate student, former graduate student, Omar Eldakar, did experiments in which he formed groups of males. Each group was a pool, had 6 males and 6 females, and these males were composed to be everything. Some pools had 6 psychopaths, some pools had 6 gentlemen, and some pools had mixes of the two. And then you watch them, and you ask who gets the girls, okay? And it turns out that in these pools, whenever there's both types of psychopaths and gentlemen, it's the aggressive ones that win. It's always the aggressive ones that do better than the non-aggressive ones. And so at that scale, there's everything is favoring the aggressive individuals. So that's part of the story. The other part is that pools in which everyone is a gentleman, the females are 3 times more productive. They have 3 times more children than the pools in which everyone is a psychopath. Because the psychopaths are terrorizing the females. They can't eat, and therefore they can't lay eggs. And so you have this huge difference at the group level. And it's the combination of those 2 things which keep both types in the population.
So David did a great job at explaining the basics of what we initially looked at, and that was that these high aggressive individuals have a local advantage over their less aggressive counterparts within groups, but that these less aggressive groups have a significant advantage at the group level compared to these aggressive groups. And what we found in a follow-up study with myself and Andrew Gallup, what we found is that the low aggressive groups, females actually laid more eggs, they lived longer, more of the eggs that they laid hatched, and more of those hatchlings actually survived all the way to adulthood. So these low aggressive groups actually were able to churn out essentially 3 times more offspring than the high aggressive groups. So we found these aggressive males really impact population growth at all levels, from female health to how many eggs she's laying to how well those eggs are provisioned given their hatching success, and how likely those offspring are able to make it all the way to adulthood in that sort of environment. So despite showing these profound differences between groups, we really have to answer this very large looming question after that was, okay, you showed these alarming differences between groups, but how do we get those different groups to form in nature? Do we actually have high aggressive groups and low aggressive groups occurring naturally? If so, then then fantastic. We can see the point you're making. But if not, then. So ultimately, how do you get that sort of dynamic? How do you get these groups? How do you get differences to exist between groups of individuals in natural systems? And it turns out it actually kind of does it on its. We actually kind of do it on our own. So I'm going to consider conditional dispersal. Conditional dispersal basically says you disperse conditionally. So just think, if you're in an environment and there's no food, you're more likely to leave. If there's food around, you're more likely to stay. If there's predators everywhere, you might leave. If there's not much predation risk, you might stick around. So animals tend to be pretty good at conditionally dispersing based on their assessment of the environment. So why not the social environment? I mean, we don't hang out with people at random. I'm sure you run into random people throughout the day, but your friends essentially by definition are individuals that you hang out with non-randomly. So ultimately you bias your interactions with certain people. So animals and all these other organisms do the same thing. If they're comfortable in an environment, they're going to stay in that environment. If they're uncomfortable in the environment, they're going to leave that environment. And they do that through dispersal. So a lot of these studies on sexual conflict preclude the possibility of female dispersal in driving group level differences. So let's, for example, if you want to look at the whether these certain sex peptides, these accessory proteins that these fruit flies produce, you want to see the advantage of that. Well, you take a male that produces a bunch of it and one that doesn't. You put them in a little test tube with a female and you go, okay, let's see what happens. And you measure the outcome. But that does not allow, that precludes the possibility that females are avoiding certain males. So all we really did in our experiment is we had individuals and we assayed them on their behavioral phenotypes. So who was the aggressive ones, who were the least aggressive ones, and we had them all kind of ranked out. And we put them in 2 different contexts. So we said, okay, here now you're in one condition where you're confined in pools. And this is kind of the classic sort of sexual conflict studies where you say, okay, here are these isolated pools, and we have the full spectrum of aggressive males. So we have high aggression all the way to low aggression in each pool with a series of females. Who's getting the most mating? So that was our first, the first experiment. And then after that, all we simply did is just say, okay, let's open up the doors in these pools and let them swim around and create their own sort of environment. So if you look at the water strider natural ecosystem or natural habitat, what you'd find is that they inhabit these nicely flowing streams where you have the prevailing creek kind of coming down the middle, and then these sort of slower flowing side pools off to the side. And these water striders will kind of hang out in little groups in one side pool. If they want to essentially move off to another pool, they'll just go into the riffle and go out to another pool. They can swim up, against the current, what have you. But they can generally move around in sort of this overall multi-group population. So we emulated that in the lab. Had this large sort of kiddie pool. We broke it up in multiple pools, and we had the circular current that sort of went around. So individuals can kind of just dash between pool and pool as they saw fit. So in one condition, they were confined to their pools. In the other condition, they were able to swim around between all of the pools and create their own social environment. So all we simply did is compare how well did male aggression, predict their mating success. And what we found is when we confined them to pools, that aggression strongly predicted mating success. I mean, it was profoundly, it was such a powerful correlation that undoubtedly males that were the most aggressive would get the most matings, second most aggressive will get the second most, and so on and so forth with each and every pool. But when we simply removed the doors and allowed these individuals to just swim around and do whatever they wanted, we didn't find that relationship at all. So ultimately, we weren't looking at different species or different mating systems. We just simply said, you can either be confined to pools, which is very unnatural, or you can have your natural environment where you're able to swim around and create your own social environment. And when they're able to create their own social environment, you found that aggression no longer directly predicting mating success. So a very, very, very different sort of predictions and outcomes for the species by just simply one little experimental tweak. One interesting thing we found from that study is that there was aggression was no longer favored when individuals could move around in their environment and create their own social groups. But we didn't really have a foothold of what was actually happening. How were they able to sort of counter this local scenario? We we predicted, essentially, or we suspected that females were perpetually swimming away from aggressive individuals and essentially settling down next to low aggressive individuals. So essentially, despite living in the same general multi-group pool, a low aggressive individual might be like, wow, there's females absolutely everywhere and they're so receptive. But a high aggressive individual might be like, wow, there's no females anywhere, and they're just, when I do find them, they're extremely neurotic and running away. So we were just particularly curious of that dynamic. So all we did, we replicated the previous experiment, and we had a camera over top and took time-lapse photography. And since individuals were individually marked, we could figure out who was hanging out with who. And we were able to replicate the previous findings. Were the most aggressive individuals that were not the most successful, and we were able to actually see through these photos and see who's hanging out with who. We were able to find that females generally associated with low aggressive individuals, and high aggressive individuals who tended to find themselves in extremely male biased environments. So despite them living in the same pool, just a few meters by a few meters, some males, low aggressive males, were experiencing environments where 70% of the time they're around females or women, and these aggressive individuals were experiencing quite the opposite, only 30%. So just imagine that. I mean, it's kind of like when you live in a certain town or city and you say, oh, I hate this place, and someone's like, oh, I love it, it's the greatest place ever. It's because you have such completely different subjective experiences of that environment. So it's kind of interesting to think of this little pool right here that males, based on their aggression, were experiencing dramatically different subjective environments, and that was ultimately influencing their mating success. So again, to reiterate, when we just simply create a more naturalistic design where individuals could freely move between pools, we found that the trend that you generally see in the field of sexual conflict, this inevitable trend of these harmful males being favored and increasing in frequency and ultimately harming the overall population, what would lead to, you predicting this species going extinct, why that doesn't actually occur. So some implications of this research are what happens to the interaction between species. So let's say you have one species that's entrenched in sexual conflict, and they're competing with another closely related species occupying a very similar niche, and they're not necessarily engaged in that much sexual conflict. So does a species where the males are essentially pummeling their females and harming their own population growth, does that give them an ecological disadvantage to essentially another species? So how does this interact? Not just how are we driving our own population, influencing our own population here, but how is this species through its sexual conflict impacting the overall community of organisms in that environment? Another context where this is relevant is also with conservation. A lot of times you have conservation attempts to isolate populations. You say, okay, let's get this population, we'll just wall them off and we'll isolate them. And as we know, when you do something like that, you might actually be heightening and favoring a whole different suite of traits via natural selection. So these animals that you might be trying to preserve, by isolating them away, you actually might be favoring high aggression type strategies and actually driving these populations that are already vulnerable to extinction. You might be hastening that ultimately that extinction event. So these are just some things to consider ultimately. So yes, evolutionary suicide, a very real, a very interesting evolutionary concept, but it generally tends to reflect the outcome of what happens when you extrapolate individual selection forward without considering other levels that are involved. So the tragedy is very likely to ensue if you don't have counterbalancing at these other levels. But that all being said, a tragedy is a tragedy nonetheless, and there's something we should consider